This is episode 267 of the Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts podcast. This episode is titled Trash Talking with Rafi Kohan. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts. I'm your host, Jennifer Crittenden. Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts is brought to you by Discreet Guide, the training company for improving your speaking and writing skills. Thank you for joining us, and tune in on Mondays for new episodes. I'm very pleased to welcome a new guest to the show today. Rafi Kohan is with us with his new book, and it's called Trash Talk, the only book about destroying your rivals that isn't total garbage, which is so great. A representation of the topic of the book in the title, which is great. So welcome to the show, Rafi.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
I'll introduce Rafi. He's an Atlanta-based writer and editor. His first book, The Arena, was a finalist for the 10 ESPN Award for Literary Sports Writing. Previously, Kohan has served as deputy editor at the New York Observer and as executive editorial director for The Atlantic's creative studio, Rethink. His writing has appeared in numerous publications, including GQ, Men's Journal, Rolling Stone, The Ringer, ESPN, The Washington Post, and The Wall Street Journal. Yeah, really excited to have you on the show. Such a good writer, such an accomplished writer, and now here with your second book, which I enjoyed very much. So congratulations on the publication of the book.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for reading the book. Thank you for the kind words, and thanks for having me. Really, I'm excited to talk about the book and whatever else might come up.
Yeah, right. We'll find out. Yeah, it makes me curious to read your first book too, which I haven't yet had the chance to do that. And I should mention that Trash Talk just came out at the end of last year, so it's quite new. And for my listeners, it's quite identifiable, you might say. The cover of the book is a huge mouth. So yeah, just look for the book with the big mouth for trash talking, and that will be it.
It's a yellow cover with a big pink mouth. Given the topic I wanted something that was attention grabbing. So that was the idea there.
Yeah, it's definitely not subtle, right? Which, no. Yeah, in general, trash talking is not particularly subtle. So that makes sense. Yeah, I think one of the things that really struck me about the book was the variety of topics and issues that you got into with this, really starting with something that we might think of as being, I don't know, kind of a cultural phenomenon or something limited to the sports world or, just sort of a weird little linguistic thing that we engage in as humans. But of course, humans are complicated. And so studying humans means, okay, now it opens up into all these, kind of various topics. And as I proceeded through the book, which is fairly hefty, actually, I could see that it had been quite an exploration for you as a writer to delve into all that. So bear with me here. I just want to read a little bit from the introduction to give the listeners a flavor of this book, because I think a lot more people might be interested in this book than they initially think. So this is from the introduction. I always knew this book was going to be about more than trash talk. As I see it, it's also about civility and moral dilemmas and the kinds of people we want to be. It's about risk tolerance and stress hardiness and anxiety and the ways in which we as humans have always sought to endow our lives with deeper meaning. It's about mindfulness, personal insecurities, and the importance of being brutally honest in our self-assessments, even as we push ourselves to the absolute limits of our abilities. Perhaps most of all, though, it's a book about learning to perform under pressure, like those military divers, because that's what trash talk does, fundamentally. It ups the competitive ante. It puts more on the line. It demands to know, can you handle this? It's a really great paragraph from the introduction, and does a nice job about explaining the narrative arc, I should say, of the book. Okay, and you start off in the book talking about trash talking from really early times, ancient times, and then all the way up to, what people talk a lot about incivility. I noticed my city council is now trying to pass some kind of policy or ordinance, to control people. Yeah, good luck with that. But it's on people's minds, this idea of incivility. And so you include some early examples of trash talking in your book. And I wondered if there were any interesting ones that you wanted to talk about now.
Yeah, and maybe we should specify for the reader or listener that when we're talking about sort of early examples, we're talking really early examples. Like we're basically talking as far back in history as history goes. There are examples of trash talk in the Bible and the Homeric poems. And you can really trace it throughout history and across different cultures. And it was important to me to kind of make that point because I wanted to make a connection between human behavior across time and across history, across cultures to show that this is nothing new. It's nothing exceptional and deviant, even though we often frame it that way,
Mm.
in the American context. But I did really enjoy, going back and learning about some of these examples, talking to scholars of the classics and Roman historians to get some of these earliest examples. And there's one example from the Iliad, in the funeral games in the Iliad, where this boxer, they're having this boxing match as part of the funeral games. And I believe his name is Appius. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If he's listening, don't hold me to it. And he says, he has this like really boastful, confident, statement before he competes in this boxing match. He says, is there any Greek alive who would beat me in in boxing, or he says, which one of you, wants this second place mule, which is the prize, because I'm going to win first place, sort of thing. And what I love about that is that's Muhammad Ali, that's Conor McGregor. These are the sort of icons of much more modern day combat sports. And here's someone conjured up, from Homer's imagination, doing the exact same thing as what athletes today, mixed martial artists, boxers are doing. So it's demonstrating that it's like, not only does it exist throughout time, but a lot of the functionalities can sort of, are kind of the same, right? By being boastful in this way, he's kind of broadcasting, this message of confidence, which puts pressure on his opponents to make them potentially, doubt their abilities to, in fact, compete with him. So that one I really loved. And then the other one that I would bring up is a Roman poet named Catullus, and he had some of the most vulgar poetry, insult-ridden poetry you can imagine. But what I love so much about him is that this one particular poem that for a long time, had never been translated into English, in its entirety, because it was deemed to be so,
unutterable.
Yeah, so just our it would completely scandalize the English speaking world. The reason he wrote the poem, and he says this in the poem itself, is because somebody stole his napkins. It's literally, that is the impetus for for these like deeply offensive insults that he levels against friends or enemies or whatever they might be. Perhaps they're both. And what I love about that is that it demonstrates an extreme level of pettiness. Right?
Yeah.
That he's so petty about this small thing that happened that he goes on to write a poem that has survived for centuries, immortalizing his enemies as he puts it, pecker-faced, and other much worse things, I should say. And it's all because they took his napkins. And what I love about that is that we are petty creatures, I think, by nature. And that's one of the things that trash talk does, in fact, is that when you talk trash to someone, that person becomes more motivated to see you lose. They don't become more motivated to win. And this was discovered in a study of trash talk in the workplace specifically. And they found the reason that they stumbled on this is they uncovered what they described as a failed mental model, which is that the people who were talking trash don't expect that the targets of trash talk are in fact going to become more motivated, that they're going to exert greater effort. But they do, and they are. And the reason is because they want to see you lose. And that speaks to a kind of pettiness that has now overcome them that they didn't previously have. And so that just brings us right back to Catullus and his napkins. And so that's why I love that example as well. Just, we have the boastful bravado of the Ali-like figure, and then we just have a guy who just wants his napkins back. And trash talk is all about all of that stuff.
Right. Full range of all of that. Yeah. As you were talking about that, I remember my classics professor explaining the role of boasting in these heroic feats, and that was actually expected. That was part of the performance, was that you were expected to give this big speech ahead of time full of, boasting statements. And then, I was thinking with, the second one, it's sort of like this idea that how does that expression go? All advertising is good advertising, or something like that.
Yeah, all press is good press.
Yeah, all press is good
press. Yeah.
Yeah, because really, I mean, and you talk about this a lot in your book, and we'll get into it more, but this idea of engagement, right? That people get fired up when you start insulting the other team, or, we definitely see this in San Diego with the rivalry between the Padres and the Dodgers. There's a lot of poking that goes on just to fire up the other side and then our people. And it's just sort of waking everyone up, maybe from our stupor.
So one of the things that trash talk does, and this also comes from that same study I was just referring to, is they discovered that on the most basic level, when you talk trash to someone, it raises the psychological stakes of competition. And what that means is really that now the outcome of this contest matters more than it otherwise would.
Exactly.
Right? By being boastful, by suggesting that you don't have what it takes, right? I am putting more on the line. There's more on the line for me because I need to back it up. And there's more on the line for you because now it's are you going to be able to prove me wrong or not? That creates an environment of heightened pressure and stress, right? There's more pressure on my performance now, and there's more pressure on yours. And again, this goes back to that question that you mentioned in the paragraph from the introduction: is can you handle it? But when we think about these environments of heightened pressure and raised stakes, what's really happening is we're making something matter when it might not otherwise matter, right? Talking trash, creates rivalry relationships, whereas you and I might just be opponents going into a competition. The second I start talking trash to you or you start talking trash to me, we start to see one another as rivals, not just opponents. And this is important because rivalry relationships are qualitatively different than just, opponent relationships. I care more about winning. I try harder. I'll take more risks. I'm even willing to behave more unethically to get a win. Again, talk about pettiness, right? And so the things that we endow with meaning by talking trash, or the ways in which we endow things with meaning by talking trash, I think is really almost existential in some ways, right? By creating these rivalry relationships, by making something matter that otherwise might not. I mean, I mentioned this in the book, but there's nothing inherently meaningful about the Padres playing the Dodgers. There's just not. It's just a bunch of strangers, wearing similar laundry and then going onto a field together, for, 2.5 hours on a Sunday afternoon. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if they win or lose. I mean, obviously we have the structure of Major League Baseball, to sort of create meaning around that. And they have salaries and these sorts of things. But playing a game doesn't actually mean anything. But we make it matter by the stories we tell ourselves about the players themselves, about things like regional pride, and about the rivalry relationship, because I'm going to get a kind of sense of worth. My identity is wrapped up in, my fandom with my own team, and that becomes even more pronounced when we raise the stakes through things like trash talk. When we say to the other team, you can't handle this, or we just simply boast about it. Because of course, the inverse of boasting by lifting myself up, I'm putting you down. By putting you down, I'm lifting myself up, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's two sides of the same coin, so it doesn't matter which one you do it. But I actually think that there is something, like, without being too grandiose, but like meaning of life existential about trash talk. It is a way for us to create meaning in a world that doesn't have inherent meaning.
Mm.
And I think that's pretty cool. I mean, you could use it for marketing purposes. Again, talking trash within the sports context, Padres, Dodgers, Yankees, Red Sox. That's a way to use it for marketing. But people use it in marketing all the time. You can look at Wendy's on Twitter and the feuds that they get into with Burger King or Chick-fil-A or whoever else, or any other kind of the Gritty, who's the Philadelphia Flyers mascot. He stormed onto the scene a few years ago with this kind of trash talking personality as a way to gain attention and to create a sense of hype and awareness around him. But also, you can think about diss tracks in music and feuds, and how much that kind of stuff just draws our attention. It's reality television. It's pundits, screaming at each other on political channels. Like, this is the kind of stuff, this confrontation, this creation of stakes that makes things matter, and that invests us as an audience, but also invest the performers, the athletes themselves, right? And so there's something almost noble about that. There's something courageous about it, because by putting something on the line, you also have something to lose. And, not everybody is always willing to do that. Not everyone's willing to put something on the line.
Yeah, that's so great. My mind is going about 400 directions at once here. But I like this idea that it is much bigger than we might think. I mean, I'm particularly interested in trash talk for its linguistic components, because I'm a linguistics major and work with words all the time. But there is a lot of humor in it. And that's also the part that I enjoy. But I think you're right about raising the stakes and creating rivalries. And it engages us and makes life more interesting. But I was thinking, it carries over into such funny things like this rivalry. I mean, it's a bit of a joke of a rivalry, because the Dodgers just beat the tar out of the Padres every time they meet each other, except with a couple of rare exceptions that we always talk about all the time. But even the libraries got into it. When the Dodgers and the Padres play each other, then the libraries will take to Twitter to make jokes about, sweeping and all kinds of funny trash talk between the libraries about baseball, which is kind of far afield. But to go back to kind of the linguistic components of trash talking, there's so many cool terms that you have in your book: bench jockeying, shit talking, and the dozens. And then another one that sledging, I think, was another one. So tell us about those words.
Yeah, I mean, they all sort of describe, except for maybe shit talking is one is maybe kind of an umbrella term, but the other ones, you can think about them as synonyms for trash talk, but they're also very specifically describe a kind of trash talk within a given setting. So bench jockeying was the term that was used predominantly in the context of baseball in the late 19th and early 20th into the mid 20th century. And the idea there was, basically trash talking from the bench or heckling, so that's why they were called bench jockeys. It was, folks who weren't in the game, or, who maybe were waiting their turn at bat, who were yelling disparaging or distracting things to folks on the field. And it was a way to try to take away from their concentration, or to otherwise, degrade their performance. And bench jockeying, actually for a while, something that I found interesting, became a kind of catch-all term for what we would now call trash talking. Because, I came across an article, I think it was in the 1970s in Sports Illustrated, that was talking about the famous UCLA coach, John Wooden. And it described him and some of the talking that he would do on the bench as a bench jockey.
Uh-huh.
Which is kind of interesting, right? That you would think about first of all, thinking about a coach, but also thinking about someone in the context of basketball doing bench jockeying as opposed to trash talk. Because of course we think about trash talk and basketball, they go hand in hand. But I think up until that point, well, first of all, at that point, the term trash talk hadn't been coined yet. It wasn't in existence at that point. It wasn't until the early 1980s that, as far as I could determine, the term was used for the first time. We understood bench jockeying to be this, sort of, extracurricular activity, this mental gamesmanship that would take place within baseball. But what's interesting is that we never actually connected that to trash talk as a term once it came about, because then trash talk we sort of considered being this new modern phenomenon that sort of emerged from activities like the dozens, like the kind of behavior that would take place on, city playground basketball courts, or, in the realm of hip hop, specifically, influenced by Black oral traditions, right? And so we sort of didn't recognize it as this thing. And so we gave it this new name, trash talk, even though, again, part of the case I want to make is that this is a universal human, activity, talking trash, regardless of the context or how it might, manifest in one, in one culture or one setting versus another. So anyway, that was bench jockeying. Sledging is sort of the equivalent of bench jockeying, but within cricket specifically, right? It's trash talk in cricket. A lot of folks wouldn't think about cricket as being a very trash talk heavy sport, right? I mean, certainly Americans wouldn't, at least I should say.
All those white clothes, right? They wouldn't do that.
I didn't think about it. They literally wear white sweaters and they take breaks for tea, right? It couldn't be a more genteel sport. But in reality, cricket is kind of the perfect game, to unleash this kind of mental gamesmanship, because cricket requires intense bouts of concentration from its players, and especially from its batsmen, who, have to go up there and perform for hours, if not actually days at a time. And when a single mistake can lead to the end of your turn, and therefore, turn a match completely in the other team's favor. So the idea of getting into someone's head, of causing distraction, of getting them to do something impulsively and make a mistake, the upside is tremendous. So of course, sledging makes perfect sense. And to speak on it linguistically for a second, we don't actually know, where the origin of the term sledging. There are some theories as to where it comes from. One is that some players who were doing this were seen to be acting as quote unquote, sledgehammers. So they were sledging. Another one is that allegedly there was a cricketer who was having an affair with his teammate's wife. And so when that other player, the one whose wife, I guess, was having the affair, would come to bat, the other team would start singing "When a Man Loves a Woman" by Percy Sledge.
Oh.
So sledging.
Oh.
Allegedly. So we don't know exactly where it comes from, but the point is that sledging is trash talk. It is just, in a different context. Although I should also say that in more modern times, in Australia specifically, as there's been a little bit of soul searching about what constitutes fair play and unfair play, this idea, crossing the line, going too far, especially with the insults and the abuse that's doled out in service of gaining these mental advantages. Sledging is now seen as something by many as inherently being too far, as going across the line.
I see.
They would probably call, fair game trash talk something more like, banter, But again, to me, it's semantic, like we'd have to argue anyway about what is too far and what isn't. But I bring that up just to say that in the eyes of many, sledging would be considered something now sort of inherently negative, especially within Australia, within Australian cricket. because the Australian cricket team for a long time was seen as a team that was constantly going too far and going above and beyond. In fact, their team, they're famously, when they were dominating the cricket world in the 1990s and early 2000s, led by a man named Steve Waugh. He was their captain. He had a term for this. He didn't call it sledging. He called it mental disintegration.
Yeah.
And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to mentally disintegrate, their opponents. So that's sledging. The dozens, which I alluded to earlier, right, is a ritualized insult game that's endemic to Black American communities. For folks who aren't familiar with it, you can think about it sort of on the most basic level as being sort of traded insults like your mama jokes sort of things. Mm-hmm. That's not the only way that the dozens exist, but that's kind of like the most basic way to understand it is, two folks who are maybe challenging one another, through verbal one-upsmanship, insults, and seeing who can get over on the other. There's often, a crowd of, inciting audience members trying to spur one on versus the other.
Ooh, he got you there.
Yeah, absolutely. But, and so, the dozens goes back more than 100 years at least, if not much further. Some would argue that it actually has African roots, the dozens. This sort of the functionality of the dozens is also there's not like a singular definition for it or singular understanding of it. Some people would, see it as being a kind of, in-group signifier. Other folks see it as kind of a puberty ritual. Other folks would see it as kind of like a survival mechanism, especially in the early 1900s when Black folks had to learn to take a lot of abuse without dishing it back out because, living in a highly and openly racist society, you had to kind of get used to some humiliations on a daily basis. And so this was almost seen by some would argue as a kind of like inoculation process to that, the ability to stay cool under pressure. But that's not, it goes far beyond that. Others would say that it was linguistic training and just frankly, and also a bonding ritual, right? This is an opportunity for friends to go at one another and to demonstrate in some ways, in a perverse way, our closeness, our relationship, because to get away with saying something very insulting to someone without it resulting in violence, and of course it still could, that's always on the table, there has to be kind of moral core or something underneath it, a kind of trust, a love that undergirds the activity so that we can get away with it. So anyway, the dozens is this insult game that then, we see kind of start to influence the behavior of athletes on the basketball court or in the context of hip hop. And this is what sort of trickles up, again, through the playgrounds, through the music scene to start to inform what we then begin to think of as quote unquote trash talk, as that term is coined in the 1980s and beyond. And we start to think of it as something brand new. It's of course not. It's an ancient behavior with a kind of cultural influence that we've exoticized because we, and when I say we, I mean like, white America now at that time and still, are just frankly less familiar with these traditions and don't really understand all of the nuance of what's happening with these games.
Yeah, and you do see it played out in so many different ways, this behavior from inside families, but I would see it a lot in the corporate world. Between male colleagues, like when they would see each other for the first time in a long time, there'd be a lot of insulting and sometimes a lot of play punching. Yeah, it's such a human behavior. It's really quite fascinating. I love the idea of the dozens in a more structured way. For one thing, because people love Scrabble, but you have to know how to spell to play Scrabble, which makes it kind of a drag. But I really love this idea of dozens as a replacement for physical violence, right? That, I wish that we could resolve our wars by just having the countries play the dozens. We'd have to pick a language, but still, it would be kind of fun to do it that way.
It would be, but there would also have to be a mutual trust, right? And understanding beneath it, right? That's one of the things about the dozens and insults in general, right? And I'm paraphrasing, someone else when I say this, but that is the dozens or insults in general can serve just as easily as a proxy for violence as they can as a prelude to it. But both are possible. Another scholar said it can be used just as easily to amuse or abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And to quote Zora Neale Hurston, she describes it as a risky pleasure because you never know where things are going to go when you start talking shit to someone, right? There's an inherent violation involved, with an insult, there's an inherent threat. That's what gives it its punch, its juice. And if somebody feels genuinely threatened by that, right? If you don't have that, support system of love or trust or respect or whatever it might be, that kind of gives us the permission to say these things to one another, then you never know how it's going to go. And so actually, I mean, I wish we could too. I wish we could solve our problems with words instead of bombs. But the truth is that when we're in more volatile situations, we probably can't handle these kinds of behaviors and these kinds of
that's not funny. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the most profound conversations I had while reporting this book was with a moral philosopher who was telling me a story about how when he was in grad school, he was having a pint with a fellow student who was from the former Yugoslavia. And he was explaining to this guy about how when he really started to become concerned that war was inevitable and that things were going downhill was when different factions stopped being able to make fun of each other.
Yeah.
When they couldn't make fun of each other anymore because the tensions were too high. Mm-hmm. So it's always the question there or the question that I would take is how can we get to, I mean, obviously, yes, we want to de-escalate, we want to get rid of tensions, but how can you create situations or structures that give people the trust that someone else is not really trying to hurt them, right? How can we have good faith with one another? Because I think without that good faith that the other person is actually not really against us, then this stuff does have the potential to really explode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this whole idea of humor, I think is really fascinating. I was thinking about that quote in your book about Satchel Paige before he threw a pitch toward someone. He would say, "I'm going to throw smoke at yo yoke," which I just cracked up. It's like, it's so funny. It's clever, right? It rhymes. There's all kinds of cool things about it. And then I was thinking, well, that actually wouldn't be very funny if he then did hit somebody in the head, which of course is very, very dangerous and could kill the batter. There's this line that we're walking between I'm saying this, I'm not actually going to do it, and also that this should be funny to you because you trust me not to hit you in the head with a baseball. And so as you're walking that line, right, it's pretty subtle. It's tricky.
But you also have, right, I mean, for trash talk to be effective within a competitive setting, right, to actually gain, and this is why this stuff becomes pretty nuanced and complicated. To gain an actual competitive advantage, you want the person to actually feel threatened. You don't want them
or at least think for a second, right?
Yeah. You want to plant that seed. You want to make someone have a little bit of fear of what might be coming. This is actually one of the techniques of sledging too, is to try to give someone, that physical fear of what kind of damage might be done to me. Like you're trying to tap into these kind of, these primal mechanisms of danger recognition and threat responses that our bodies and our brains are pre-wired to kind of react to. And when they do, physiologically, we have there's seriously negative effects in terms of how we respond in terms of in performance situations, because our bodies are not activating and optimizing for performance. They're activating for responding to a threat, which, is about preparing for damage and curling up into a ball.
Or running away. Yeah,
right? Or running away. Absolutely. Mm-hmm. It is interesting that you want to be able to say a thing that you can get away with, right? But getting away with can change based on the context. I mean, Satchel Paige certainly hit plenty of folks, but maybe more important to him than hitting someone was just planting the seed that they could be hit, right? You want them to be distracted. You want them to be thinking about that possibility instead of focusing intensely on the ball coming out of your hand and whatever, and picking up on the spin that might be, is this a curveball or a slider, or is this a two-seam fastball or whatever? Because even that kind of minor distraction, stealing even a little bit of someone's attention, can have serious impacts in terms of competition and in terms of outcomes.
Yeah, and especially at the level that people are playing at now, at these really elite levels of athleticism in sports. They're looking for the slightest advantage because things turn on the smallest thing. So yeah, so it's definitely a technique
Yeah.
that people are using. Yeah, as you were talking, I was, this whole idea of distraction, right? The hey, bada, bada, bada. It was pretty mild. I'm not even sure it would classify as trash talking, but pretty mild compared to, yes, your life is in danger here,
Yeah.
right? Sort of, yeah, the other extreme. But I want to talk a little bit too about this idea of forcing someone to make a mistake as a result of a mental lapse. Because I certainly used to use that with my older brother. And you talk about sibling rivalries in the book, which is quite fascinating. So that would be my technique, right? Because he was bigger than I was, so he could always beat me up. But if I could provoke him by trash talking, then I could get him to punch me, and then my parents would intervene and he would get in big trouble. So it's a very effective way of using the authorities to come down on someone that I couldn't overpower physically. So yeah, tell me a little bit about sibling rivalries and trash talking.
Well, yeah, it sounds like you were a hockey pest before your time, because that's one of the areas where you find that strategy in particular coming into play, where guys just try to get under each other's skin, and whether it's through, just annoyingly poking at them or saying something insulting, but just baiting them in any way they can, because they're trying to get their opponents to lash out, to lose their temper, to become distracted by emotion and to make a poor decision and then get a penalty, which gives their team an advantage. Or even if they don't go so far as getting a penalty, because they're thinking about you and maybe they want to smash you into the boards when they get a chance. So pulls them slightly out of position. And now your team
Yeah.
has a strategic advantage in other ways. I mentioned sibling rivalry, and specifically the rivalry between Cheryl and Reggie Miller in the book, and within a chapter about pests specifically and attention, because I think siblings, I mean, and part of the reason I think that Reggie Miller, who is an all-time great trash talker and one of my least favorite basketball players of all time, because he always, he just rubbed salt in the wounds of my New York Knicks, famously, jaw with Spike Lee on the sidelines and get my favorite player, John Starks, to, explode violently and headbutt him and, in the tensest and most important moments. But there was something special about Reggie because he could get under people's skin in a way that reminded me. And I'm one of five, right?
Oh, yeah.
So I have
There you
four
go.
siblings. So I just simply recognize this, from my own experiences growing up. But there's something about it being a sibling that I think, conditions you to picking up on those things that are going to really bother somebody, right? What can I do to provoke this person? And what can I do to provoke them in a way that I can get away with also, again, right? Because to be able to, so you and your brother, for example, right? You talk crap to him, but you do it in a way that your parents aren't going to come down on you. And that makes him even more mad, right? Because you're doing something that he thinks is unfair. And that makes him feel like there needs to be justice, right? And this, by the way, is another thing that we can see, from the research about trash talk and about, the idea that it gets people to sometimes behave more unethically as a result, is because they think that the other person is getting away with something that they shouldn't. And so
They started it.
They started it. So you are absolutely taking advantage of that. And I think, yes, siblings, I think trash talkers, I mean, I haven't done any, I don't have any qualitative or even quantitative data on this to say that Siblings make the best pests and make the best trash talkers for one reason or another. But it's intuitive to me that the siblings who grew up with rivalry, who spent time getting under each other's skin, they're just truffle pigs for those nerves, those exposed nerves. And they're going to find the thing that's going to bother you. And then they're going to keep pressing that button and pressing it and pressing it and pressing it and pressing it. And until, they get to a point where now, like, you've become so primed to this button being pressed that they don't even have to press it. They just have to look at it, right? I don't even have to say it anymore. All I have to do, right, is just sort of hint at it. And suddenly you're triggered. Your threat response is the same as if it was, as if I was, punching the button with all my might. So I do think there's something special about siblings in these relationships, and especially if you're trying to get under someone's skin, if you're trying to get them riled up, if you're trying to distract them, right? Because distraction is one of the key mechanisms, key pathways by which trash talk can actually affect performance.
It's all so great, right? Because I think you talk about that in the book, sort of this idea, what did I do? I was just looking at him, and the other person goes crazy because, they have this long history, and
exactly.
Something like that. This seems like a really good time to talk about mental preparedness for defending against trash talk, because you spent quite a lot of time in the book investigating that. So what all did you learn?
Yeah, I really enjoyed this kind of, the response chapters in some ways, right? How to respond to trash talk or how not to respond to it. Of course, I knew going in that I was going to want to better understand, like, how to handle these situations when someone is raising the pressure on us, when someone's trying to get under our nerves. What is the best way to deal with that? But the more that I learned about trash talk and actually what is really happening psychologically, and as we mentioned before, this idea of raising the psychological stakes, of raising the pressure. And when we say pressure, it's not just this kind of amorphous general idea of like, oh, this is an important moment, but literally the stress and anxiety in our body, rises as a result of this sort of thing. So it's the ability to perform with stress in stressful situations. How do we do that? I wanted to learn from the folks who are best practice in performing under stress. And where that led me was actually to the military. Mm-hmm. So the idea of performing under pressure really speaks to ideas of mental toughness, right? Of resilience. And specifically within mental toughness, the ability to exhibit mentally tough behaviors in these pressurized and high stress moments. To do that, you have to understand the ingredients of mental toughness. What is a mentally tough behavior? And that's where you get into things like mental skills. Mm-hmm. And mental skills, I mean, all of this stuff, in some ways it sounds like, I don't know, like made up language of like, what, like, this is like mindfulness and whatever. Like, I mean, I don't think these are made up terms, but like, it sounds a little out there, right? It sounds a little like going to a yoga retreat and we're just going to, think about, our bodies and breathe for 24 hours or whatever. It sounds like real hippy dippy shit. That's the term that I was struggling for there. Mm-hmm. But the truth is that
very woo, we might call it.
Yes, thank you.
Very
woo, very woo. Absolutely. That's the other term I was struggling for. But training your mind is just as important as training your body. Mm-hmm. Right. And so it starts with things like self-awareness. When I say self-awareness, I mean things like a couple things. One is, how do I perform at my best? What are the conditions that I need to be at my best? And so to understand this, you need to understand sort of like performance psychology, the ways in which that trash talk actually threatens to, disrupt, your performance through the psychological models. And that includes things like, how much anxiety do I need in my body? Like, where do I operate at my best? And then how can I get there, right? Self-regulation. So understanding both where I need to be and then how to get there. And then also understanding when I'm not there, when someone has distracted me and now my focus isn't where it should be, when someone has distracted me and that's caused physiological arousal and now there's more stress in my body than I would want. Mm-hmm. How can I get myself back to where I need to be? But also self-awareness in terms of things like, what are my strengths and weaknesses, right? What am I sensitive to? What am I insecure about?
Yeah. What are they going to say that's going to work?
Yeah. Because if you can't be honest with yourself about what are the things you're sensitive to, what are the things, or frankly, what are you not good at? And as an athlete, there's so much ego, right? There's so much pride. Saying like, well, I'm great. I'm the best.
Good at everything. Yeah.
Good at everything. Well, guess what? Maybe you can't shoot very well from the 3-point line. And if your defender is saying, give it to him, he can't shoot it, let him shoot it, let him shoot it. They're playing to your weakness and they're playing to your ego at the same time. And if you haven't done the mental work to come to terms, with your own strengths and weaknesses, to understand what's happening here and to not respond out of ego, you're taking away from your own game and you're taking away from your team, and you might end up on the bench because guess what? If you're not a 3-point shooter and you're jacking up shots, you're not going to be playing for very long, right? Mm-hmm. So self-awareness, self-regulation, understanding what you need to be at your best and how to play to your own strengths. These are all incredibly important. So using these mental skills, but it's not just being able to use the mental skills, it's being able to use them when they matter, when the stress is high. And so this is the next key thing, which is practicing these skills and practicing them under pressure, practicing them in the conditions under which you're going to need to use them. And so this is why I went, to the military, is because they have incredibly stressful training courses and curriculums, especially within special forces where I spent time. I looked at SEER school, which is infamously high stress survival school, and what they need to do there is deploy these skills of resistance, right? SEER stands for survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. It's basically a prisoner of war camp. So they simulate prisoner of war situations, and the students, are going to be interrogated. They're going to be physically coerced, which is a fancy way of saying tortured and beat up and hit. And they're going to try to get them to break. They're going to try to, break the group bonds and single people out and get people to say, you know what, I wanted to save myself. And I'll tell you something so I can save myself. What they want is the students to use the resistance techniques they've been trained on to come back to, reinforce their group bonds, to lean on one another, and to make it through, without breaking, basically. And everyone breaks, but the point is that they want you to have practice these skills in the most stressful situations. I also went down to Key West, where the Special Forces runs its combat diving school.
Yeah.
And they don't need to pressure them in the same way. They don't need to trash talk them. As they do at SEER. SEER, they try to get in your head in every way possible.
I see.
It's kind of like the most sophisticated trash talk on earth, because they're trying to say the thing that is like will most get under your skin, the thing that you're really not prepared to respond to. But in dive school, the training itself is just so high stress that you're underwater. You're not able, they're knocking, your breathing piece out of your mouth. You're suffering from hypoxia. You're literally having this urge, this primal urge to take a breath, to shoot to the surface, to use your buddy as like a launching pad to get to the surface, pushing someone else down to get to the top. And you have to fight against those urges, and you have to practice them.
Yeah.
And you have to practice them under stressful situations. The term for all this is stress inoculation, right? You need to practice the behaviors you want to exhibit in the conditions in which you're going to be performing in. And the idea is that you become, if not inoculated and completely immunized to these stressful situations, you at least get to a point where they're not completely overwhelming, where you're not having a panic-inducing stress and threat response to them. This is an important lesson obviously, this transcends trash talk. This is,
right.
This is about all kinds of pressure in any situation. And a lot of sports teams do indeed, use these kinds of training models. They'll pipe in sound noise, crowd noise, when they're going to play in a really loud environment, or they'll speed up practice to make it like a more pressurized, difficult to succeed in an environment. But what they don't do specifically is actually trash talk their players. Like that is a form of distraction, a form of stress that is that is not really, at least not officially introduced as a kind of stress inoculation. A lot of players will take it on themselves to
Mm-hmm.
talk shit to one another in practice.
Mm-hmm.
It's a way to up the intensity of practice, right? It makes it matter more than it otherwise would. And so that makes you practice harder, and that's a good thing for getting better as a player and as a team. But it's not really something that coaches themselves are doing. And so even if players are used to certain kinds of distractions and sort of, cueing themselves back into the moment as a result of those distractions, or responding to other kinds of stressors that may exist within the context of sports, and self-regulating as a result of that, they don't really get used to, all of the possible stressors that trash talk has to offer. And I think it's actually a missed opportunity that
Mm.
coaches, again, if you have true, sort of global mental toughness, the ability to perform as a situation demands, regardless of the possible distractions or stresses of that moment, trash talk's not going to bother you because it's a transferable skill. But if you don't sort of conceptualize trash talk in that way, if you're taking it personally, if
Mhm.
you're letting it get into your head in any way, then you don't have that global mental toughness. You have to understand, trash talk as just another stressor, right? Understand that
Mhm.
what's really being said doesn't matter, because what's really happening is just that you're being given a psychological test. Trash talk is a test.
Mhm.
Can you handle it? Can
Mhm.
you focus on the things that matter? Right? Can you get to where you need to be and perform in the way that, that's best for you, in spite of whatever I'm saying? So yeah, that was really important to me. And I was like really psyched and frankly surprised that the military gave me the access that they did, to learn about their various courses. So yeah, I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating part of the book that I didn't expect to encounter. And as some of the reviewers on Amazon also said, this book just went into so many different areas that I hadn't anticipated. But yeah, we probably don't talk a lot about that kind of thing openly because it is quite terrifying even to read about it,
Mm.
to see the tests that they're being put under, that kind of pressure. Yeah, and I was thinking too, I think it might have been more of an old school style of coaching. I think in today, at least in the environment, the bubble that I live in, if we had a coach who trash talked his players to try and inoculate them against what the other teams might say, yeah, the moms would get involved right away.
But because it's a good point, right? Because you can think about it like the sort of the drill sergeant in the military, or
Hmm.
certainly my high school basketball coach. Lots of the moms were always saying things because he was incredibly disparaging to some of our own players during games. But it's not just insult for the sake of insult. There needs to be actually like a structure around it, right? It's not like when these soldiers are put through these incredibly stressful situations, to the point of failure, right? Because like
Hmm.
you want to get folks often to the point of failure. You want to see the limits of people's abilities. Where are they going to struggle? Where are your weak points? You have to understand these things. If you want to be mentally tough, right? You have to figure out first where you're weak. But when your coach is just like telling you that you're garbage and you messed up and all this and that, you're not really getting the stress inoculation. Because I'm going to be paraphrasing a neuroscientist here. I might not get his quote exactly right, but it's like it's not the unlearning of fear, but it's understanding that stress is survivable, right?
Hmm.
So it's the idea is that like you have to go through a stressful thing. In fact, you have to go through a distressing thing. You have to get to the point of distress. And then you have to be able to reconceptualize that as something that you survived and something, therefore, that you can survive again. And so
Right.
that it's not threatening, right? It's not going to kill you. And
Hmm.
that's how actually you gain the resilience to those kind of stressful situations. But there needs to be a structure for that. Somebody has to like bring you back in and help you see that the fact that you failed wasn't actually a sign of your weakness, but a sign of your strength, right?
Hmm.
The fact that you survived it. And then you begin to reconceptualize these experiences. And you have a kind of Rolodex then of experiences that you can reference in future tough situations where you can tell yourself, I can handle this. I can do
Hmm.
it. This isn't a reason to feel threatened. It's not a reason to feel afraid. But so when we think about that drill sergeant or that like old school coach, I just don't think they were doing that, right? They were yelling at the guys, but they weren't also giving them a structure of support to then understand this in like a positive coping sort of way. So you need to understand it holistically, or they needed to understand it holistically. It's not just insulting, it's not just stressing people out or distressing them, but it's doing it with a purpose and understanding how you're going to get them to that point of resilience, how you're going to get them to that point of mental toughness.
I do a lot of coaching for people on speaking skills, and people are often very afraid. They suffer a lot of stage fright. And one of the techniques that I use is to talk about stakes and what really is at stake in these situations. But of course, really what works is experience, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, so I mean, you can coach all you want, but actually having a client go and have a speaking experience and for them not to die
Yeah.
is actually much more beneficial than all my blah blah about stakes. So yeah, weaving those things together is probably the most effective. But yeah, it's interesting to think about that. The idea of, just get through one, and that already now gives you one card in your Rolodex. You survive that one.
Exactly. When you talk about stakes with your clients, is it that to make them think about that they don't have as much to lose as they think, that the pressure is lower? Is it the idea to lower the pressure?
Yeah, or at least put it in perspective. I mean, it is a mental exercise, right? And there is value to it, but definitely what is much more valuable by multifold is to actually have some experience and survive it and discover that it's not as bad as you thought it was as you imagined in your mind.
Right. But I think also, but what you say to your clients is actually really important, because when you're going through that experience in the first place, you have to actually cope with the stress of it. And that's a coping mechanism, right? Because if you're having, a threat response to being on stage and talking to people, which is totally normal and like one of our most primal fears is public speaking, because it taps back into like these fears of actually being like kicked out of our tribe and being deemed unworthy, which is something that trash talk does too. But but before you get to that point of stress inoculation, you have to actually first cope with the stress. You have to get through it somehow. That's so much of what SEER does, is it's teaching folks to cope with the stress, to get through it, so that then they have that referenceable experience. So I think that's actually a great technique, but it's but it's like it's a stepping stone on the path
to the next one.
Yeah.
The other thing that I was thinking, in our protected world, one of the things that was kind of fascinating about baseball during the pandemic was that people were playing in empty stadiums, and so there wasn't the crowd noise, which we talked about can be an additional stressor, whatever we call it, the 10th player on the field or whatever, but that people could hear the other dugout, and all that the umpires could hear what people were saying. And I was kind of amused that, in our modern world, normally they don't hear that. I mean, there's trash talk through the media, right? But they don't normally. And so it was kind of an interesting moment for people to experience trash talk in real time that they wouldn't otherwise hear, because the crowd noise would be so loud that they wouldn't hear each other. Yeah, it's kind of an interesting time.
Yeah, well, and that touches on a couple of interesting things. One is, I remember reading stories about how some players were saying that how it was really hard to get up for those games, right? To get the engagement. And that speaks to, again, I think the sort of, the psychological model that says that, certain people have, require different levels of anxiety to be at their best. And if you need, some people, maybe you got conditioned or to having crowds and this sort of thing, and raising the stakes in terms of having all these eyeballs on you. And so I think some people were probably really hurt by that. But the other thing is, I had a player tell me that the most distracting environment he ever played in as a football player wasn't, and he's a punter, so he, it's like very specific task-oriented thing that he'd have to do.
Super stressful.
Right. But because it's like all comes down to like one small moment, a few times in a game. But the most stressful and distracting conditions he competed in were not like backed up in the end zone and like the black hole or something with Raiders fans all around him and breathing down his neck, but it was actually in an almost empty stadium when the Detroit Lions were winless one season. And he was like, because you could hear what people were saying in the stands. You're just not primed to tune that out. 10,000 people, 50,000 people telling you that you suck, whatever, that's white noise. But like one guy having a conversation with his, with his friend about, his sister-in-law's birthday party coming up, it's like, it was just harder to tune that out. Your mind is, your psychology, your mental toughness is in some ways going to be even more tested because it's like, those aren't the conditions you were prepared to compete in, right? Like we're talking about before, you train for the conditions in which you're going to compete. And like that was a wholly different environment.
Right. Yeah, exactly. These new things, right? Things that are going to surprise you or catch you out.
Yes.
Right. Well, it's been so fascinating to talk to you. I've just enjoyed it so much and really enjoyed the book. Again, for my listeners, I'll say the title again in case you've come in the middle. So the book is called Trash Talk, the only book about destroying your rivals that isn't total garbage. Yeah, really great. And before I let you go, Rafi, would you like to share anything with the audience, anything you want to refer them to that I should include in the show notes?
Oh, I mean, the main thing is definitely the book. I'd be honored and delighted if folks were to read it or check it out. I also recorded the the Audible version.
Oh, wonderful!
If people prefer an audio format, but it's available. You can certainly find it on Amazon or anywhere online or at your local bookstore. I'm sure they can order it if they don't have it. But yeah, that's the main thing. And please review it and rate it on Amazon and Goodreads. 5 stars only, of course.
Unless you're a total loser.
Unless you're a total loser. That's anything below 5 stars, I'm going to judge you. But no, that's really it. This was so much fun. And yeah, I feel like we could have kept going because there's so much here. And I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you again. It was lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Our goal in 2024 is to expand our audience because we get such great guests. So we'd love your help in spreading the word by sharing, subscribing, liking, thumbs upping, rating, and commenting. Got all that? Really, thanks for any support. Books, Shows, Tunes, and Mad Acts is brought to you by Discreet Guide, the training company for improving your speaking and writing skills. Also, a shout out to Podomatic, our podcast hosting platform. You podcasters out there might want to check them out. They've been good to us. And finally, thanks to Quincas Morera for the theme music.